Hello and welcome to the second lesson of APUSH Period 5. Today we're going to be talking about manifest destiny. So to start off, I always like to emphasize the learning objective. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the causes and effects of westward expansion from 1844 to 1877. Now, I want to let you know that if you check down in the description of this video, you can download guided notes to help you make sure that you're paying attention to the most important information. So you can find that in the description. So, this topic is huge for period 5, and there's really 4 historical developments that are happening that are emphasized by the College Board. So, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the economic opportunities that are going to be part of migration to the West. You also want to pay attention to the debates over acquiring new lands. So, why do people support the land, acquiring new lands, and why were people opposed to it? You also want to pay attention to how the government, the federal government, was involved in the extension of land. And then finally, what effects did this have on the American relationships with Asia? So here is your outline. This is what we're going to be talking about in this lesson, but I want to let you know that this lesson is not exactly chronological. As opposed to some of the other lessons that typically are found in US history, this lesson is a whole bunch of developments and processes that are happening concurrently. And so it's really more topical than chronological. So just keep that in mind. And a lot of the events are also going to be repeated in future lessons of period 5. Okay, so quick review on movement west. After the Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark were moving to the west, and that really began migrations to the west. Lands in this area were often disputed with other powers, and rapid increase in migration really began after the 1850s. And there's a few reasons for that. There were economic reasons, religious reasons. So groups like the Mormons, who were often persecuted in the eastern areas, decided to relocate into Western territories. The idea of romanticism, this concept manifest destiny, the gold rush, and then the resolution of border disputes. So we're going to cover all of those things throughout this lesson. So really a review here of the trails west. Our early migrants to the west were going to be primarily men, and they're going to be fur traders, also known as mountain men. And so they're going to be responsible for carving a lot of the paths that will end up being used later on by increased numbers of American settlers. The most popular, of course, is the Oregon Trail, and it was an incredibly difficult journey. So, what was the economic potential of the West? Why were migrants desiring to move to the West? Well, after 1848, the gold rush is going to spark intense scrambles by migrants to get to the West and engage in this extraction of minerals. Farming was the more common reason why immigrants came to the West. They were looking for cheaper land and they wanted to start their own homesteads. And then as more migrants came, there became more urban opportunities, business owners, people that would actually feed the migrants or give them supplies, clothing for the miners, laundry, the creation of banks and transportation resources. So all of those things created a new market for economic activity. So, another aspect for increased migration is going to be called Oregon fever. This idea that people were feverishly getting out to the West. And this was fueled by Romanticism. So, this is an artistic movement, and it is going to really emphasize beauty and nature and have emotional images. So, here's one specific to the West. It's called Immigrants Crossing the Plains, and you can see it's a beautiful image. It makes it seem kind of like this just an enjoyable journey. And this didn't just affect the way that people painted, it also affected the way that people wrote. And so when they would write back home about their life in the West, they tended to exaggerate what life was actually like, which then created a stronger desire from people who were in the East living in, stifling industrial conditions to decide, oh, we would like to try out that lifestyle. All right, so speaking of Oregon, we're going to go right in here about what was happening in Oregon during this time period. So, this area that you can see up in the Northwest is going to extend beyond what we know of as today's US and Canadian border. So, this area at one point was jointly occupied by 4 different powers, but since Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, it was only occupied by Britain and Americans. And there was an extremely profitable fur trade there, which is why both sides wanted to maintain occupation of the area. So, at some point in the 1840s, Britain and Americans were both ready to end this joint occupancy, and so they proposed the 49th parallel as the division. But presidential candidate Polk, who is campaigning on the promises of expansion, is going to argue 54, 40, or fight. So he's referring to that northern line, that's the 5440 latitude line. And he's saying that Americans will get the entire territory or they will fight for it. And so debates ensued whether this is a good idea or not. Many slaveholders were opposed to the idea because they were fearful it would become a large free territory and would upset the balance in Congress, whereas expansionists were supporting the idea that it was in the best interest of the United States to gain the entire territory. Also, there's going to be a war with Mexico on the horizon at the same time. And so questions were about whether the United States could actually engage in conflict with two separate powers at the same time. So Polk wins the election and eventually he compromises with the original plan, the 49th parallel. Okay, so manifest destiny. This is a very important term. This is something you absolutely need to know for the APUSH curriculum. This is a term that's an old idea, just with a new name. And so it's going to be coined by John O'Sullivan, who was a writer. And it comes from one of his writings that says, the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. There's more to it, but that's kind of the gist of the passage. So enthusiasm for this idea of conquering the entire continent was fueled by ideas of nationalism. The population was increasing and desired more lands. There was rapid economic development, if you remember the market revolution from period 4, as well as those technological advances and reform ideals. So all of those things created this push, this desire for increased territory. This is an image that is most often associated with the idea of manifest destiny. So it's a painting by John Gast from 1872. And so when I teach this image to my students, I encourage them to pay attention to a few things. I encourage them to pay attention to what is the most prominent thing that you're seeing. And obviously that's that angel-like figure in the center of the page or in the center of the painting. And so she's representing liberty and she is traveling across the continent. I tell them to pay attention to the coloring. And what you notice is the right side of the image is going to have more of a golden, brighter hue. And the left side of the image is going to have more of a dark, darkness to it. And so it's demonstrating that light or goodness is going from the east to the west. And then you pay attention to more of the particulars. So you can start looking at some of the smaller details. You might see that she's carrying the wires with her as she's coming across the nation. And the railroad is following behind. So technology is following. You can see farmers and you can see them coming in the Conestoga wagons. And then you also see American Indians and the buffalo fleeing from this. And so really this is an image that demonstrates kind of the many aspects included in manifest destiny, ideas of liberty or democracy, ideas of technology and settlement, and then also that impact on the American Indians living in the region. So support for manifest destiny was often found by the Democratic political party. Okay, so they will claim that the U.S. had a divine mission, that it was ordained by God, that God had blessed the United States, and it was their duty to spread democracy and Protestant Christianity as opposed to the Catholicism that was there with the Spanish. It really created this patriotic mission to become a world power. One representative from Illinois said that he did not believe the God of heaven designed that the original states should be the only abode of liberty on earth. On the contrary, he only designed them as the great center from which civilization, religion, and liberty should radiate and radiate until the whole continent shall bask in their blessing. This is not new ideas. Americans have done this since the beginnings when they began to encroach on American Indian lands, and it doesn't end in this time period. It continues on with other groups such as the Hawaiians and the Filipinos later in American history. So, opposition to Manifest Destiny, this is primarily going to be found by the Whig political party. And really, they emphasize that America should work on improving its current land rather than expanding. And there were also fears over the expansion of slavery. So, anti slavery advocates would have not wanted more land out of fear that it would upset the balance in Congress. But pro slavery advocates were also opposed to it. Some were because they worried it could add more free states. And additionally, some just viewed that the violence associated with expansion was unethical. So here's a quote from a preacher, William E. Channing. It is time for us to stop in the career of acquisition and conquest. Already endangered by our greatness, we cannot advance without imminent peril to our institutions, union, prosperity, virtue, and peace. That the Indians have melted before the white man, and the mixed, degraded race of Mexico must melt before the Anglo-Saxon. Away with this vile sophistry. There is no necessity for crime. There is no fate to justify the rapacious nations, any more than to justify gamblers and robbers and plunder. We boast of the progress of society, and this progress consists in the substitution of reason and moral principle for the sway of brute force. So you can see how these debates over annexation would have divided the nation over what to do as people began to migrate to the West more rapidly. So, another example of a contentious area is going to be Texas. And so, this is an area that had had long standing border disputes. In 1821, things begin to change, however. Mexico wins their independence from Spain, but Texas, the region, was not populated very fully. And so, some Americans are given rights to live in the area as long as they become Mexican citizens. So they pledge loyalty to Mexico. One American is going to be Stephen F. Austin, and he is going to recruit many Americans to come to the area. So Mexican or Americans moving into the area of Texas were not allowed to have slaves and were required to convert to Catholicism, but they did not really follow these rules. And it was primarily ignored until about 1830. But then the Mexican government is going to there's going to be some changes in 1830 to the Mexican government, and they're going to close the region to further American migration. This is going to lead to Americans revolting. They desired to have slavery. They did not want to convert to Catholicism. And so they begin to revolt and call for the autonomy of Texas. Stephen F. Austin is going to go to the Mexican government to negotiate for autonomy. After being arrested, he sends a letter that says, "War is our only recourse. There is no other remedy." So war begins in 1835 when Americans captured the fortress at the Alamo. The Mexican president, Santa Anna, is going to respond by sending troops and completely destroy the fort and kill every American that was there. This becomes a major battle cry moving forward in this revolt for Texas independence as Remember the Alamo. So in 1836, the American leaders of Texas are going to declare independence, and they create a constitution. They elect Sam Houston as president, and Austin is chosen as Secretary of State. And what follows is a battle at San Jacinto where Santa Anna is captured, and then on the threat of death, he is forced to sign a treaty recognizing Texas as independent. And so at this point, both leaders, Houston and Austin, are going to desire annexation and write to the American government to ask to be annexed, to be gained as a state as part of the United States. But the American government is not going to annex right away. There's going to be debates over whether this is a good idea. One part of the debate is that it would be a new slave state. And so that would upset the balance in Congress, and they feared how that would impact the overall issue of slavery. They also worried about how it would affect the relationship with Mexico. Trade with Mexico was an important part of the American economy, and the Mexican government did not officially recognize the treaty that Santa Anna had signed. And so, if they annexed Texas, that could be seen as an act of war. So, the election with Van Buren was they didn't want to take any really controversial steps on Texas during that time. And so it's not until after Van Buren is elected that there is a proposal for the annexation, which the Senate then rejects. We'll continue to talk about Texas in the next lesson when we're talking about the war with Mexico. All right, moving on to another territory is California. So in the 1830s, it was incredibly far distant from the governments in both the United States and Mexico. In the 1830s, there's a variety of groups that live there with different aspects to their way of life. But by the 1840s, many of the American immigrants desired that California become part of the United States. In 1845 and 1846, U.S. Army Captain John C. Fremont claims to be exploring and creating maps in the area, but really he orders the locals to stir up pro-American revolts. And so this is kind of influenced by Polk's campaign. And he says in a message to Congress that the California harbors would afford shelter for our Navy, for our numerous whale ships and other merchant vessels employed in the Pacific Ocean, and would in a short period become the marts of an extensive and profitable commerce with China and other countries in the East. So even Polk, the president, is beginning to advocate for the acquisition of this land in California. In 1848, gold is discovered and mass migration begins. This leads to thriving commercial centers and the growth of cities. We see a huge rise in immigration, which has catastrophic impacts for the American Indians living in the area. And we see additionally a huge number of Chinese immigrants coming to the region in this time period, and they will also experience harsh discrimination. A little more about the Goldseekers. The initial Goldseekers primarily were white men. However, we also see American Indians, free blacks, enslaved African Americans moving to the region, as well as thousands from Mexico. And then as years go on, there's more from Europe, South America, Australia, and China. And by 1860, about 10 years after gold is initially discovered, about a third of the miners in the area are Chinese. So the gold rush peaks in 1852, but we continue to see people coming with the hopes of economic prosperity, and enough will come to California that they will apply to become a state. Now, the war with Mexico has already happened, which is the topic of our next lesson. And so California is a U.S. territory at this time, and so it applies to become a state. And this is going to be hugely controversial, which we'll discuss in another lesson, the Compromise of 1850, which will admit California as a free state. So it did ban slavery, but it would not end up giving California the right to vote. The Californios, the native, the people that had been living in the territory when Mexico was in charge and when Spain was in charge, are not respected. Many Americans will just straight up take their property, and the American Indians in the area experience, like I said before, huge casualties and an intense drop in their population. Okay, so moving on to how the federal government supported expansion. There's a few different acts. There's many more than this, but these are just a little bit of a picture of how the federal government encouraged expansion. The preemption acts gave squatters the right to settle public lands and then purchase them for low prices. So they wanted people to move to the land and allowed them to purchase land for low prices. In 1851, there's a treaty of Fort Laramie. This is going to give specific lands to American Indians if they allowed for peaceful American migration. So trying to create more peaceful interactions with American Indians in the hopes that more Americans will feel safe to move out to the new Western lands. In 1862, there's going to be something called the Homestead Act passed, which is going to grant 160 acres of land to applicants who promise to live on the land for 5 years and improve it. And if after 5 years they have done that, then they get the land essentially for free, just paying the fees of the application. In 1862 as well, the federal government is going to pass the Pacific Railway Act, and this is going to create the Transcontinental Railroad, and it's going to give private companies incentives, essentially financial incentives for constructing the railroad. So all of these things demonstrate the federal government's interest in increasing land in the United States and increasing migration to these lands. And they do this really for economic reasons. They believe that there are vast resources in this area, and the more people who move out there, the better it will be for the federal government overall. And then in the red box, you can see that there's a few different things that happen that also demonstrate the federal government being interested in expanding west, whether that's through the military with war with Mexico or secret negotiations. The Austin Manifesto was an attempt to have Cuba become part of the United States. And so those are all other federal actions related to the actual acquisition of land. Okay, and then our final topic here is diplomacy across the Pacific. So in the 1830s and 40s, American whaling in the Pacific was significant. And there were very diverse crews as far as race. However, very few women were a part of this. And trade really increased during this time with Asia. And so Honolulu and San Francisco are going to develop as major port cities. And this will fuel migration to the areas. It's going to increase intense missionary efforts in Hawaii. And it's also going to begin negotiations to secure trading rights and use of ports. Additionally, at this time, Britain had maintained dominance in the trading relationships with China. The US attempted to challenge that dominance, however, ended up really shifting its focus and creating more of an economic relationship with Japan. It's important to note that at this time, the diplomacy efforts, like beginning negotiations and those types of things, often included military intimidation. And so the gaining of ports was not just a peaceful negotiation, it did include some more intense military actions. So finally, thinking back to that major learning objective, explain the causes and effects of westward expansion from 1844 to 1877, really zoning in on that term manifest destiny and the reasons for manifest destiny, and then thinking about the various locations like Texas, like Oregon, like Hawaii. How are those areas affected by the increase of U.S. territory, the acquisition of new lands, and the migrants that were moving to these areas? So thank you for watching. I know this was a long one, but this was a huge topic that I wanted to cover in depth. If this was helpful for you, please like and subscribe.